Welcome to today's webinar on the Electrification Futures Study, or EFS as we call it. My name is Trieu. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory here. I will be giving some housekeeping remarks and introductory remarks, but the main speaker today will be my colleague, Zhou, and she will be presenting the latest results on the EFS study on power systems operation of high electrification scenarios. So first, some housekeeping. Everyone should be muted for the duration of this webinar. The webinar will be recorded here, so we will post the webinar recording on our study website. You can see that listed at the bottom here, nrel.gov-EFS, after a couple days of transcription and whatnot. So you can answer questions, or you could ask questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side. I'll be monitoring those throughout, and we'll certainly plan to leave some time to answer and go through most of those questions. I'm sure you have some good ones here for Ella and I. For those who again, we can't get to the questions at the end, and if we run out of time, please do feel free to reach out to us, either of us, or go on the website there, and you can find our contact information as well as at the end of the webinar. So with that, I'll get started here. I do hear some background noise. I wonder if we could mute non-speakers. Thank you. So first, just want to start off with some intro on the EFS study. I've had the honor to work on this study for the past 4 years, starting in really in earnest in 2017. And it's been a great experience. I've learned a lot from my colleagues. I've learned a lot from the work and a lot from the reactions from all of you. But the EFS is a multi-year study led by NREL, but certainly including multiple valuable contributions from the organizations listed on this slide here. And the study was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy, Energy Efficiency, Renewable Energy Strategic Analysis Office. So we certainly appreciate the support that office has provided. For those who've looked at electrification, or those who could imagine electrification, it's a very complex topic. It's complex due to the interactions across all the different sectors, the interactions with different technologies, with between the power grid and the use of electricity. And so the EFS study is set up in a way where we have taken bite-sized approaches, if you will, on the various topics related to electrification. Let me see here. It's not advancing. There we go. So the first, the way the study is set up is a series of publications and data sets and models associated with electrification. The first data set was published in 2017 and led by my colleague Paige Jaden, providing a set of cost and performance trajectories for electric technologies and use electric technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps for water heating and space heating needs. So a valuable data set that we really use to conduct the scenario analysis that you'll hear more about soon. And the scenario analysis was first published in 2018 and started with what we called the demand side scenarios. I'll go into a little more detail in the next several slides, but essentially the scenarios look at the adoption of electric technologies and their implications for the electricity demand, which obviously has implications downstream as well. The next publication was around documentation of a new model called the demand side grid model. This was led by my colleague Elaine Hale. And what we recognized was a need for new tools and data to address, analyze electrification. What DS Grid does is provide a kind of a bottom-up approach in modeling hourly demand down to the county level, given adoption of different end-use equipment. This is an ongoing and continued effort. Again, very complex because it encompasses multiple sectors. I'll have a link to the DS Grid website at the very end, but certainly feel free to contact us for more information on the updates on that modeling approach. And on the power sector models, our fourth publication in the series, led by Enong Sun, we recognize that there are limitations in our long-term power sector models on how to deal with electrification. For those out there who do long-term energy or power system capacity expansion models, this could be a valuable resource to look at least our approach on how to tackle things like demand-side flexibility, things like implications with natural gas prices and price elasticities driven by electrification. So we use those new modeling approaches in the next part of our scenario analysis within the EFS. We refer to these as our supply side scenarios published earlier this year and led by Caitlin Murphy. Here we projected a series of long-term power system evolution scenarios through 2050. We'll go into the subset that are relevant for today's webinar. Nonetheless, you could dig into this report for a richer expansion of all the drivers behind power sector evolution that we modeled, at least. And lastly, we end up where we are today, the latest and last in these series of publications, looking at how the power system might operate under these highly electrified systems. Will be the main event for most of today. To clarify some of that scenario analysis, given the complexity there, this slide summarizes the data flow and models used. On the left-hand side are the demand-side scenarios, which were generated using the energy pathways model from Evolved Energy Research, supplemented by a series of other models and tools. Again, the main purpose here was to analyze scenarios that looked at greater adoption of end-use electric technologies, and for the purpose of today, their implications on electricity demand. We'll have an additional couple slides on that. In the middle column is the REEDS capacity expansion model, regional energy deployment system model used to generate the supply side scenarios, primarily looking at the infrastructure, transmission, as well as generation capacity needs to satisfy those new demands from electrification. This is critical for today's analysis because we use a subset of the scenarios in that in 2050 to feed into the operational analysis using the production cost models. And the purpose of really the left-hand side here is because these long-term models necessarily need simplified representations of very complex things. So we're essentially modeling directly the unit commitment economic dispatch problem to handle the greater amount of renewable energy, greater amount of flexible loads on an hour-to-hour basis to examine some of the resource adequacy and reliability questions associated with these high electrification scenarios, as well as giving a better estimate of the value of some of these flexibility and integration questions. Okay, so that's the general flow. I hope that was clear in terms of how the linkages across all the modeling efforts and where it leads us to today. I wanted to also provide some quantification so you have some better context on what we mean by high electrification, what we mean by higher renewables and the like. So starting with this chart, which is from our 2018 demand side analysis, you can see historical as well as projected annual electricity demand across all the sectors, industry, residential and commercial, and transportation. You can also see that what we refer to as high electrification at the very top there is largely driven, not entirely, but largely driven by vehicle electrification, at least on an annual electricity demand basis, such that overall demand reaches 6,700 terawatt hours by 2050, and significantly faster rate of growth than we've experienced in recent history, and especially compared to our reference scenario. We don't model the medium scenario in today's analysis, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the details there, but really it's those high and reference scenarios that we'll be looking at. Of course, power system planning and power system operations are dependent not only on the total amount of electricity demand in a year, but also the shape of that demand on an hour-by-hour basis, et cetera. So what we note here is in these high electrification scenarios, the impact is such that there are greater, sharper, and more frequent peak demands. This has a lot of implications for integrated renewables and the value of flexibility, including demand-side flexibility, which Ella will get into. A little bit more on the peak load, because the previous slide really emphasized vehicle electrification's impact on annual demand. We just want to note that, again, it's not just the annual values, and it's not just those total bulk numbers that are important, especially when looking at the operational aspects of electrification. So what's shown here is from these high electrification scenarios, a shift away from just summer peaking demand to a wider range of peaks and a variable range of peaks across the seasons and months. And that's in large part driven by electric space heating needs under these high electrification scenarios, and particularly in the northeastern regions and across the Midwest as well. So what's shown in the chart, in the maps, is the magnitude of annual peak load. That's the size of the pie. The distribution of the pies are the top 100 hours and what season they fall under. And again, you see a shift in our model results from 2015 to 2050. A greater amount of blue in those pie charts represent a greater amount of winter peaking in those states, and primarily in the colder latitudes in the eastern side of the country. Okay, so that's the demand side scenarios. What we're taking from the supply side scenarios is the generation capacity mix, as well as the transmission capacity developed and modeled using the Reed's model. There are actually three main scenarios that we're looking at. Starting at the bottom is the reference scenarios. That's what REF stands for. And this is essentially our current policy scenario projected through 2050 using our moderate technology assumptions. And from this scenario, you can see a substantial increase in wind and solar capacity, but also a substantial amount of existing and expansion of natural gas capacity in particular under these business as usual, if you will, environments. The next group of scenarios, the middle three there, labeled as high, refers to high electrification. And largely speaking, the mix of capacity, the capacity mix, is very similar to the reference scenario, although the magnitude is much greater to accommodate the greater amount of overall electricity demand, as well as the greater peak demands as indicated there. Finally, the top three scenarios are what we refer to as high RE. So high referring to high electrification, high RE meaning high amounts of renewable energy, predominantly from variable renewables. That's wind and solar in the blue and yellow there. The driver that we looked at to generate the scenario is using low renewable and battery storage costs from our annual technology baseline. And not surprisingly, you get greater amounts of installed capacity in the renewables sectors, as well as in storage. You get a reduction in natural gas capacity relative to the high, standard RE scenario in the middle group, but nonetheless, you could see the differences there. The amount of renewables here, Ella will get to in terms of generation numbers, as that's an outcome of the model, and that's one clarification here. All the results that are input, the results from reads that are input into the modeling are on capacity bases. We are modeling the dispatch of these generators endogenously in the analysis that Ella will explain. So that's two dimensions. We've covered reference electrification, high electrification, baseline renewables against high renewables. The last dimension, and the reason why you see 8 bars instead of 3, is demand side flexibility. That's shown in the blue bars in the stacked charts there. And we look at a range of flexible load or demand side flexibility in the charts. You'll see DSF labeled from no flexibility whatsoever to low flexibility and high flexibility. Ella will explain how we modeled the constraints on flexibility across all the different end uses and sectors. The driver for the different total amounts of flexibility is through different assumed participation rates across the sectors, and that's based on our earlier analysis, as I explained in the beginning. Now, I know that's a lot. This is 4 years of work that we're trying to cover in the hour today, but I hope it clarifies the starting point that we're taking off, that Ella will take off now, and explain in terms of the modeling methodologies and findings. I see there's several questions. I will try to answer them now or throughout the webinar. And with that, Ella, I'll turn it back over to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Drew. So we use Paxos to investigate whether hourly electricity demand and operating reserves can be met, and the trends in electricity prices, regional power exchange, renewable curtailment, and other operational impacts. Paxos is a commercial production cost model developed by Energy Exemplar. For this study, we use Paxos to develop hourly grid simulations for the REIT system built in the previous EFS studies like Trieu has just introduced. It has some, It has the same geographical resolution as REITs, but with hourly unit commitment and economic dispatch and more granular representation of different types of demand-side flexibility. Unit commitment and economic dispatch means determining when each unit will be on and off and at what level it will be operating for each hour under a range of physical and resource constraints to meet the electricity demand at the lowest operating cost. So we model 14 types of flexible loads. Here we can see a breakdown of the total annual 2050 flexible loads by sector in our high electrification, high flexible loads scenario. And it amounts to about 17% of the total load. Similar to energy storage, demand-side flexibility in our model can shift energy consumption from 1 hour to another, and it can provide operating reserves. But it is also different from storage in that it is constrained by a variety of factors, including the time series availability, the fact that end-use service must be provided at the end of the day or end of the week, and other specific demand constraints. For example, let's say I have a water heater. I probably don't care if it kicks off at 4 in the morning or 6 in the morning, but the service has to be provided at some point of the day. Otherwise, the result is I won't have hot water for my shower. So demand side flexibility is a lot more restricted than storage. Even though we see 17% of the load being flexible on an annual basis, they're not actually available all day, every day, and then when we actually want it. And another point we want to make here is that there is no operating cost of demand side flexibility in our model. We're only analyzing the gross benefits of flexible loads, but similarly, we also assume zero operating cost for storage and variable renewable energy. We have 3 research questions we're focused on. The first one is, how do future power systems operate to serve electricity demand with new and changing loads from widespread electrification? For this question, we'll look at the scenarios with varying levels of electrification, but without demand-side flexibility. The second question is, how might flexible loads be dispatched and how do they impact system operation? For this question, we'll compare the high electrification scenario with and without demand-side flexibility to see how that works. The third question is, how do flexible loads operate in high renewable, high electrification futures, and what's the value of their flexibility? So for this question, we'll compare scenarios with 2 levels of renewables, 43% and 66% nationally, and see how flexible loads work in concert with the renewables. The answer to our first question is yes, high electrification scenarios can be operated at hourly levels, even with high variable renewable energy penetration. And the table here highlights the scenarios we're comparing in this section, which is the reference electrification, high electrification, and high electrification, high RE without demand-side flexibility. The modeling shows that the portfolios built in REITs are resource adequate. It can serve more than 99.99% of the load and 99.93% of the operating reserves at hourly resolution in all 2050 scenarios. And on the left figure, hold on. I want to get my pointer. Okay, there we go. On the left figure, it shows the 3 annual generation bars from our modeling results. And this one is from reference electrification, high electrification, and high electrification, high RE without demand side flexibility. Variable renewable energy, and then we define it as wind and solar PV, amounts to an annual average of 66% of generation in the conterminous United States in the high and the high RE no flex scenario. But this by no means implies that's the highest renewable penetration the system could achieve, because low carbon and other scenarios, for example, can drive even greater renewable penetration. For our purposes, the study demonstrates that the system can serve the load and operating reserves at hourly timescale under high electrification and relatively high renewables. Our results show that transmission supports high electrification and high VRE. High electrification and high VRE penetration lead to higher average utilization of the transfer capabilities between the interfaces. This figure shows the 3 scenarios: reference electrification, high electrification, and high electrification, high RE without demand side flexibility. And this is a box plot of the average utilization rate of the regional interfaces, and then each interface is shown as a gray bubble. The bigger the bubble means the greater the max flow, max capacity of that regional interface. And this one is showing here that REITs already built 5% more transmission capacity in the high electrification scenario and 23% more transmission capacity in the high electrification, high RE scenario compared with the reference electrification scenario. But still, we are seeing high utilization rate with higher electrification and high VRE. So this highlights the importance of interregional transmission in supporting a high electrification and a high renewable future. We also found that quite a lot of congestion happens at the top, especially with interfaces of smaller transmission capacity. This indicates that the transmission expansion envisioned in our previous EFS report is crucial for system operation, because if we have a lot of transmission congestion, that will lead to high prices and problems in the grid system. Are there any questions for clarification so far?
I think not in this section, Ella, so you should please proceed, and then we'll answer the other questions later.
Okay. The answer to our second question is that demand side flexibility can increase power system operation efficiency, particularly valuable for systems under high electrification. For this section, we are only comparing the scenarios of high electrification, high renewables, and then with varying levels of demand side flexibility. Demand side flexibility increases power system operation efficiency and reduces system operating costs, primarily by increasing demand during low price periods and decreasing demand during high price periods. This load shifting helps increase utilization of generators with low operating costs and avoids turning on higher cost units. So the top figure here shows a one-day dispatch of the national power system for January 3rd. The dashed line here shows the original load without the shifting. And then the delta here between the dashed line and then the current top of the stacked area shows how flexible load is shifting demand in that day. And then the bottom figure is a zoom in of the delta showing the flexible load dispatch. Bear in mind that from the grid perspective, reduced energy consumption looks like generation. So it reduces consumption during the evening periods here and increases load from around 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. corresponding to the diurnal solar generation. We also see that demand-side flexibility can help facilitate supply and demand balance. This figure here shows the system net load ramp duration curve. Net load is the total load minus variable renewable generation. Net load ramp is the magnitude of the net load changes per hour or per 5 minutes, depending on the operating interval. And we model it per hour here. This figure essentially orders the hourly net load ramp by magnitude in the high electrification scenarios with and without flexible loads. The ramps greater than 0 are upward ramps and the lower than 0 ones are the downward ramps. So you can see the scenario with flexible loads indicated by the orange line has smaller up and down ramps. By providing flexibility during the more stressful periods, such as the morning and evening ramping periods, flexible loads can reduce the amount of net load ramp in the system. We also find that flexible loads can reduce thermal plant cycling. This left figure focuses on a 1-week operation of the coal fleet and the natural gas combined cycle fleet with and without demand side flexibility under high electrification. So on the left side, it's without demand side flexibility. On the right side, it's with demand side flexibility. The top of the yellow portion indicates committed capacity from these two types of generators, and the red area indicates actual generation. So the delta here shown in yellow are capacity that is committed but not used for generation. The spikes in red shows that the generators are ramping up and down. This illustrates that fossil fuel generators do not have to ramp up and down as steeply under high electrification if we have flexible loads. And for capacity that does get committed, the utilization rate is higher. And here we see that demand-side flexibility can lower the number of starts and shutdowns of natural gas combined cycle units, but the impact on coal starts is negligible. So here we see the 3 scenarios, and with the addition of flexible loads, the number of starts and shutdowns per year for natural gas combined cycle fleets reduces. This is because natural gas combined cycle units require shorter start time compared with coal, and it can conduct daily start and stop operation if needed. And there is indeed greater need for them to do so under high electrification. But because demand-side flexibility drives down the overall system ramping needs, as we just saw in the previous slide, they do not have to start and shut down as many times. Operating reserves are extra generation available to meet imbalances in supply and demand due to factors such as errors in forecasting, generation and transmission equipment unavailability, unplanned outages, regulating requirements, and others. This is an illustration that demand-side flexibility can provide operating reserves by holding shiftable capability available to meet the regular or unforeseen changes to supply and demand. You can see under contingency and then under flexibility reserves, with the addition of flexible load down here with each scenario. Natural gas CC and CT indicated by the purple portion here is reduced. Storage indicated by the pink portion here is also reduced, and hydro the teal color here is also reduced to some extent, but the blue portion showing as the demand side flexibility takes over as the main provider of these reserves. This figure here is not showing flexible loads serving regulation reserve because the assumptions for the study were developed some 3 years ago. In reality, with FERC Order 2222, aggregated distributed energy resources, including flexible loads, can participate in capacity, energy, and ancillary service markets operated by an RTO or an ISO. They are the organized wholesale power markets in the United States. Flexible loads will be able to serve some regulation reserves in the future, even though that's not modeled in our study. In later slides, you will see the total system cost savings from demand-side flexibility, but this one illustrates that demand-side flexibility can effectively reduce electricity price variability and volatility. This is a price duration curve that orders the hourly prices nationally from high to low. From this figure, you can see that the addition of demand-side flexibility allows the wholesale energy prices to stabilize around $30 per megawatt hour for more hours of the year, indicated by the pink line here. That's because it reduces the number of extremely high price hours caused by having to turn on some very expensive and less efficient generators. And also it reduces the number of extremely low price hours caused by excess renewables, essentially renewable curtailment. Do we have any clarification questions?
No, I think there are some questions about assumptions around flexibility, but I think it'd be better to group them at the end. So please proceed on.
Okay. So our third finding is that demand-side flexibility can enhance operation efficiency of high electrification, high VRE systems, reducing costs and carbon emissions. For this one, we're looking at only high electrification scenarios with different levels of renewable energy and different levels of demand-side flexibility. We find that flexible loads can reduce renewable curtailment. The average post-curtailment national VRE penetration in the high electrification scenario are around 43%, and in the high electrification, high RE scenarios are around 66%. A lot of curtailment happen in the springtime. When the demand is low. And in both set of scenarios, the addition of demand-side flexibility can lower curtailment. So the top figure shows the high electrification scenarios with varying levels of demand-side flexibility. At the bottom figure here shows the high electrification, high RE scenarios with varying levels of flexibility. So you can see with additional flexible loads added, curtailment always go down. In total, the high levels of flexible loads can reduce curtailment by around 16 to 18% in these scenarios. But the spring curtailment, as you can see, remains pretty high because only daily shifting or weekly shifting demand-side flexibility is considered in our modeling. This suggests that maybe longer duration sources of flexibility, such as long duration storage or electrolytic hydrogen production, might have a potential here depending on their costs. Overall, we see that demand-side flexibility can effectively lower system operation costs by using more efficient units, reducing VRE curtailment, reducing system net load ramps, and thermal cycling. This amounts to around 9% of total system operation costs in the high electrification scenario and 10% in the high electrification, high RE scenario. Note that the high electrification, high RE scenarios here in itself is less than half of the total operation cost of those high electrification scenarios because of the savings in fuel costs mainly. The gross value of demand-side flexibility without accounting for costs of implementing and operating it is around $4 to 16%, $4 to $16 per megawatt hour of availability, and that is the total system saving divided by the total annual amount of available flexible load. Or the value could be $8 to $22 per megawatt hour of energy shifted. So that is the total system cost saving with demand side flexibility divided by how much energy is actually shifted during that year. This value of demand side flexibility diminishes as additional flexibility is added. We also see demand-side flexibility work in concert with electrification and high variable renewable penetration. Electrification by itself reduces carbon emissions in the broad energy sector because the energy efficient nature of many electrified technologies. The energy sector-wide carbon emissions are reduced by 23%. 1.1 billion tons of CO2 in 2040 by going from reference electrification to high electrification. And this is shown as the shaded tall bar at the back here. The solid portion at the front shows the emission from just the electricity sector. So you can see under high electrification, the total energy sector emission is reduced but shifted into the electricity sector. We find that flexible loads can enhance the ability of VRE to lower CO2 emissions in electrification futures. The percentage difference marked here are in comparison to equivalent scenarios without flexibility. So this one is saying reference electrification with high flexible loads can reduce 2% emission compared with reference electrification without flexible loads. And then high flexibility reduces 5% of emission under high electrification and 8% of emission under high electrification, high RE scenarios. Overall, we find that the study shows that the U.S. power system can operate under systems with widespread electrification with high amount of variable renewable energy. And then we have 1.5 terawatts installed capacity, 66% of annual national generation. Demand-side flexibility, which is dominated by electric vehicle charging under high electrification, can enhance operational efficiency by reducing system ramps, reducing thermal plant cycling, and increasing utilization of more efficient generators, resulting in a gross benefit that is without accounting for the cost of implementation of $8 to $22 per megawatt hour of energy shifted, or 4 to 16 megawatt hour of available flexible load. The complementary relationship between demand-side flexibility from newly electrified load and variable renewable energy is particularly pronounced. Flexible loads can reduce renewable curtailment and thereby reduce power sector CO2 emissions, resulting in up to 10% of total system operating cost savings and 8% emission reduction in high RE, high flex scenario compared with no flexibility. That's it.
Thank you, Ella. Really great presentation, Ella. We have several questions coming in here. Maybe I'll start with some more immediate ones here. Can you I think you clarified this on this slide here, but flexibility, the cost of implementing flexibility and operating flexibility, can you explain that again?
Right, so we're not modeling the implementing cost or the operation cost of demand side flexibility because, for instance, if we are just changing the hour of use of a dishwasher, it doesn't add cost to the customer. It's more about cost of incentivizing such behavior. And then we do not currently have the greatest data on how to incentivize these demand side demand response. That's why we did not implement these costs, but we also do not have operating costs for storage. So in that way, they are actually on an equal footing in our modeling.
Great, Ella. I think that really touches on several questions here. So first, as Ella noted here, we don't have costs for flexibility implemented both on the capital side as well as the operating side, and therefore the values that you see here should be interpreted solely as a value of flexibility. Endogenously modeling both the cost and value, of course, would be good, but we're still data limited there. Lots of questions on how these demand side flexibility scenarios were generated and the trade-offs between storage and flexibility. Just for clarification here, and I'll take this one, Ella, since it's in the beginning part here. A lot of the flexibility assumptions were exogenous to the model. And therefore, what we did was layer flexibility, the amount of flexibility, different amounts of flexibility on top of a portfolio that had a fixed amount of storage. And therefore, we don't see these deployment trade-offs between demand flexibility and storage explicitly in this analysis. And again, we don't have costs for implementing flexibility, and therefore we couldn't really conduct that here. In our prior study, we did look at different exogenous levels of flexibility and how storage deployment might change with those. So please refer back to that other study there. Ella, you touched on this as well on the operational side, trade-offs between storage and flexibility. I know you just mentioned that there are operating costs for either one of them, so in some ways it's degenerate. But can you kind of speak to the behavior of storage dispatch and flexibility dispatch, how they're similar, what are the trade-offs and competitions there?
Oh, I was muted. Because storage is not as constrained as our demand side flexibility. So in a lot of way, I think if we are looking at a megawatt to megawatt basis, storage definitely offers more flexibility. But we are seeing demand side flexibility and taking a lot of the solar power generation during the middle of the day and then contributing to meeting the evening demand and then evening and morning ramps here. So in that way, I think it's very complementary to what storage is doing, but it does replace some of that. It does replace some of that diurnal shifting, but because storage does not have the weekly or the daily balancing constraint or the hourly profiles as demand side flexibility have, storage will be able to, for instance, maintain a state of charge for longer durations. So storage definitely has an advantage there.
Yeah, thanks, Ella. I think overall, I should expand on my previous comment and question a little bit more, is we did see in the prior analysis that there was a trade-off. If you had more flexible load, your storage deployment would be more limited. And what Ella is mentioning is there are shared grid services between storage and flexibility, and therefore there's some competition and reduced need for one if you have the other. And I should expand that beyond just storage and demand side flexibility, but other sources of grid flexibility. Yeah. So an important set of trade-offs to consider. Some more on flexibility, on the amount of flexibility in our scenarios versus other studies. Ella, I know you've been working on other work on, grid interactive, efficient buildings, as well as the Brattle Group has put out a kind of a technical potential on demand flexibility. Can you comment on, the level of flexibility we're modeling here to give people kind of sense of context with some of these other studies?
I'll just add one more point on the storage part. Is storage, of course, has a storage has an efficiency loss, which may or may not occur in demand side flexibility. And then a lot of the demand side flexibility might be temperature related, so you might even have an efficiency gain. For instance, if you are able to start your HVAC during the cooler times of the day versus starting your HVAC at the at noon during middle of the day. They're just different. And then in terms of the flexible load, I would say there are a lot of uncertainty surrounding how much load would be flexible, how much would the participation rate be. For instance, in the grid interactive buildings in the GAP roadmap, the participation rate is around 65% for the highest participation case. And for our EFS study, the participation rate assumption is 70%, so very close. And then our assumption for the light duty vehicle participation rate is 90%. So higher than the building sector. I would say there are just a lot of uncertainty regarding how much load could be flexible and how to incentivize greater participation from the demand side. I would say this is an active area of research.
Great. Thank you, Ella. I think just some more clarification on some of those participation rates is that's essentially a parameter on the number of customers who have signed up for such demand flexibility programs. We do apply kind of limits on the fraction of megawatt hours used to run different appliances that can be flexible, as well as the timing and whatnot. So it's actually not the total megawatt hours consumed are flexible. They're a subset of that. Some related questions on what your thoughts are on how aggregators might play a role, especially with system operators using demand flexibility, and maybe a related one to that is what do you view as kind of how flexibility is achieved through utility programs, through pricing, or what's the mechanism there?
I think we have seen some studies of time of use rates being effective, different incentivized programs. I think at this point we might need some communication technology, IT technology, to support the bilateral communication between the wholesale markets and the DSO and then the end users. So aggregators will play a very important role in setting up such platforms and making things easier for the end use customers to participate in the markets, because demand side flexibility, as we have seen here and in the previous studies, can provide really a variety of services ranging from capacity to energy to all kinds of ancillary services. So the challenge is really how to use them for the different services in a way that maximizes the customer profits. And there is also opportunity here for social equity and justice. For instance, if a renter can see that the residents are underusing electricity because of they are low-income households or something, then they might be able to offer solutions where they can increase their consumption during the middle of the day when the solar is producing, and then the wholesale electricity price is very low, and then that can kick their AC on so that it reduces their chance of getting a heat stroke or having other health impacts. So I do see a demand side flexibility playing an important role as long as we take these considerations into our design of the programs and then incentivize them correctly.
Thanks, Ella. I think in the modeling world here, this is a centralized dispatch problem. So in some ways, it's agnostic to the exact mechanism that might be employed in the real world. I think there are a lot of experiments going on and studies going on. I think it's going to be varied. But just to clarify, in the modeling world, it is a central dispatch problem. Okay, turning away from flexibility to some other topics on how you modeled the power system. Requirements. So first, must-run assumptions. What did we include in the modeling, and how might it change with different kind of must-run assumptions?
No, we don't have must-run units, but usually we assume nuclear would be on. Unless they're off for for its annual maintenance and outage schedules.
Great. And some other clarifying questions around the different operating reserve products, flex, contingency, and reg. What are the differences in the modeling? Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I should have memorized this off the top of my head, but it's been 2 years since we've done this. So we model 3 types of reserves. We have regulation, flexibility, and let me just pull this up really quickly. So for our regulation, the time frame is 300 seconds. For contingency, the time frame is 600 seconds. And for flexibility reserve, the time frame is 1200 seconds. So essentially, flexibility is like to serve the imbalances between the real-time in the real-time markets, caused by, let's say, a forecast error or something, and then contingency and regulation. Regulation is for smaller changes in imbalances in supply and demand, and we have contingency kind of standing by.
Thank you. And maybe that relates to the second question is, we've modeled things at the hourly basis. Question, broadly speaking, is what do you think the impacts would be if we included sub-hourly modeling, especially with respect to, control of flexible loads?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because if we have sub-hourly modeling, we would probably see greater variabilities in renewables showing up, requiring having different requirements for these operating reserves, and then a lot of the demand side flexibility, they could respond pretty quickly, as we have seen some studies of having HVAC systems or refrigerators responding to regulation reserves. So very fast responses from demand side flexibility. Note that the demand side flexibility, they are aggregated, they're not single units. So in aggregation, they are capable of these regulation type of reserves. So we might I can't say for sure, but I have a feeling that we might see higher values for these demand side flexibility if we model it sub-hourly. But it will be an area of research, I think.
Yeah, I think it's already hard enough hitting our limits modeling national scale hourly modeling. I think sub-hourly would be great. It's needs an area that needs exploration, perhaps for case studies in certain regions. And for those out there who are interested in doing that, we'd love to share notes if you get to it. A related question, maybe more broadly than just sub-hourly modeling and reserves, is how are we managing backing up renewables, given the large share of renewables in some of these scenarios compared to today? Can you comment on that?
I would say we're not exactly backing up renewables. I would say demand and supply are changing all the time on both sides. It's not just renewables. And then as we have seen with high levels of electrification, it changes, the load shapes. It increases the peak of the peak load, the magnitude of the peak. So it is definitely changing the load. If we are not able to respond to these changes in load shapes and future demands, we would be in big trouble. But the good thing about electrification is that it also produces a lot of opportunity where the loads can be flexible and be used for balancing. And then we do have a lot of resources in our model because our renewables national penetration is just 66%. Nationally post-curtailment renewable penetration. So we do have a lot of natural gas units as well as demand side flexibility and storage to meet these demands for resolving imbalances. But we might, and we have other studies like our LA 100, and where renewables gets to a higher penetration, we're able to meet these demands from a very, very high penetration renewable system. I think the system operation gets challenging after we have renewable penetration higher than 90%, but that's a different research issue.
Thanks, Ella. Maybe I'll tack on a little bit to that, which is, the key thing here for this latest analysis is in some ways we're testing the portfolios that were determined by our prior modeling analysis. And in some ways it tests the resource adequacy questions related to those portfolios. And the limited amount of drop load or drop reserves that Ella presented earlier indicates at least that these portfolios are likely to be resource adequate. Obviously, a lot more needs to be done to ensure full reliability, but it's indicative that the renewable isn't causing a huge obvious problem in many of these portfolios. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to not be able to tackle all of them, but there is a big question here, Ella, that maybe you'll take a first stab and I'll follow up, which is how would all this change if we look at more, should I say, aggressive or ambitious set of scenarios, both along the lines of higher electrification as well as lower emissions grids. Do you have any thoughts or speculations on if we were to extend this?
If we have higher electrification, then hopefully we would also have higher amounts of flexible load. Otherwise, higher, very, very high electrification, and then super high level of renewable energy without any demand side flexibility, I think would be very challenging and expensive for the system to operate.
Yeah, thanks, Ella.
What do you think?
That's helpful. I think that also helps us clarify a couple things. This study is focused on direct electrification. So some think about electrification, including indirect electrification, for example, through hydrogen and other kind of pathways. This study also didn't look at energy efficiency directly. So in terms of more aggressive carbon mitigation type of scenarios, presumably some of those come into play as well, and they'll pose both challenges, but also kind of additional flexibility, perhaps at longer durations that could be beneficial as well. A lot more work needs to be done in that space, of course, but we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to share a couple of slides. So Ella, if you could go to slide 23, that would be great. And this is actually a good segue to a list of other resources that I just wanted to point your attention to. The EFS study obviously was an in-depth study over multiple years, but it's a very hard problem. A lot of remaining issues, as we just discussed in the Q&A here. So we expect continued research in this area, both from our organizations and partners, as well as I'm presumed from many of you as well. So we want to make these resources available. You can see the study website again, nrel.gov/EFS. There's hourly demand data, there's flexibility data, there's scenario data from the supply side analysis. So you can look at other scenarios that we didn't get a chance to probe. A lot of the EFS assumptions will be embedded in our annual standard scenarios product. So we'll be looking at EFS-like scenarios going forward, likely in a rolling basis. Things change quickly in the energy world, as we all know, and so these kind of annual updates will help us maybe refine some of the insights here, as well as extend the scenario analysis to the questions around what happens if you have deeper decarbonization, what happens if you have different kind of clean energy policies. The annual technology baseline is another one of our annual products that recently was extended to include the transport sector and extended beyond electric options. So please do use that resource. We're hoping, I think, pending support from our sponsors to extend that even further to other sectors. So super valuable for this kind of analysis. And lastly, there are two models, the DS Grid model I mentioned at the outset, as well as a new model, Tempo, that looks at a broader set of mobility options on the transportation side, even beyond the on-road sector. Building tools is something we enjoy doing, the broader team, and we recognize the need for a lot of these teams beyond the power sector models, which is the bread and butter of at least mine and Ella's group. So next slide, Ella. So with that, I know we're out of time, but I certainly want to thank all of you from the really large EFS team at NREL and with our partner organizations. It's really been an honor, as I said, to be a part of this study. Great team. I hope to work with many of the folks on here going forward. Again, thanks to DOE for their support. And thanks to our reviewers, including a very robust technical review committee that really helped us throughout all of the years. And we hope to continue this work with all of you and keep engaging in this dialogue. And with that, we'll close out today. Please do feel free to reach out to me and Ella if you have additional questions, and we'll post this webinar once we get it transcribed. Thank you all. Have a good day.